Welcome to Shamanic Voices, a podcast aimed at bringing our ancient, indigenous Nordic wisdom traditions and perspectives, bringing these to bear on the challenges that we face in our modern world. I am your host, Georg, and we will often be joined by co-hosts, Laurie as our producer, and you can find our bi-monthly episodes on most major platforms. And if you enjoy this and like to read as well, please look up our blog with dozens of articles on health-related topics at www.teutonichealing.com. And now, let's get on with our show. Hello, and welcome to Shamanic Voices, where we try to delve into the facts and underlying currents behind current events and the factors that shape our lives through the lens of the ancient Teutonic mysteries that we know as Vortru, Asatru, or Suomenescu, etc. We peel back the layers of current reality and see sometimes ancient themes, and we're very lucky in this quest to be joined by other light bearers, if you will, light workers. And Ashley Grog is one of them. She's an MSRN nurse with over 20 years experience and is one of the principals involved in this Hoosiers for Health Freedom, which is something we all need part of in these days where we have allopathic tyranny trying to force vaccinations on us, whether we need them or not. And anyway, we welcome Ashley to the show, and please tell us what you've been working on recently.
Well, thanks for having me back. I really enjoyed our last episode. And recently I was telling Laurie beforehand that I am just finishing up my book called Resuscitating Nursing. And it is a practical roadmap for nurses to learn how to participate in politics, whether that be at the unit level, the hospital level, or state, national, political realms, because we have to be able to advocate for ourselves. And I think that that's what this show, helps do, is teaches people how to advocate for themselves and choose the right care modalities for themselves. And I feel that allopathic medicine, and this is part of the reason I left allopathic medicine, has lost a lot of its moral character and integrity. And my hope is that we can resuscitate nursing and bring that back. So,
well, I tend to think of you nurses as patient advocates first and foremost, above all other advocates. I can remember one time having a kind of a crippling migraine and going into this supposedly clinic thing we could walk in during the day at a local hospital, and found out later I got charged with a full hospital admission for going there for like 3 hours, okay? As if you'd been there overnight. And I actually took it up with one of the members of the board. This was just a complete hustle because you weren't consulted about it, but I was kind of like bent over in pain, and the doctor said to give me Imitrex, I think was the right thing, to counter the migraine. And the nurse, and he was going to put it, I think he was going to give it IV. And she said, no, it has to be given in the muscle. Otherwise it can cause scarring of the, I forget what it was, but there was some big deal. And he started arguing with her, and she whips this book off the shelf. I don't know, maybe it was PDR, said, here, right here. And he was just shamefaced, but she was absolutely right. And fortunately, she saved me a lot of pain, because that would have been not a good injection to get that way. So I was just looking at her as there's a patient advocate stepping in and preventing.
It's absolutely wild, because the nurse's license can be taken away if they don't catch things like that and harm comes to the patient. And what a lot of times will happen is the nurse will end up being litigated against, have complaints against their license, even though the doctor wrote the wrong order. So there's supposed to be levels of safety checks. It's supposed to go through, the doctor is supposed to obviously know what he's doing, write the order. Pharmacy is supposed to, check the order and make it sure it's okay. And then that nurse is that last line of defense. And so in that case, if that nurse would have given that and caused you significant harm, she would have been the one on the hook. And they say how doctors know everything and doctors are always right and this, that, and the other. But you have this, this glaring issue where it's not the doctor necessarily on the hook. If the nurse gives that, she's, right there because she is the one that was supposed to stop that from harming the patient. So good on your nurse. And it's another reason why we need good moral, critical thinking nurses out there to take care of our patients, is because sometimes the doctor doesn't know what's best.
Well, it kind of sounds like what how good government should work, and how our founders envisioned it as checks and balances. You have not just one party making a decision, but being reviewed by two other parties, make sure it comes out right. And I can think of a case I had with an individual who's a wife of a retired Marine officer and was stationed at I think it was Camp Lejeune, where they had the dry cleaning fluid was leaking into all the water. So you were taking a shower in it, you couldn't smell it, you were drinking it, and it caused massive harm to everybody. And they were there for years, like he was permanent cadre and all these issues. And then she was having just incredible things happening to her. None of the doctors could figure out. So I said, give me a list of what you're taking. Well, there were all these overlapping medications, one from a neurologist, I think one from a rheumatologist. There was the GP, there was some other level, I forget. Anyway, there were like 4 different doctors prescribing. Nobody had looked at the overlap. So I just took GoodRx and a couple of the other websites where you can look up. And right there in the primary interactions warnings were several of these agents. And I just did a spreadsheet and wrote it out and said, here's your problem. Correct this, and I think most of your symptoms will go away. Well, she took it back to her primary, who was just absolutely embarrassed by it, and said, yeah. So she immediately deleted 3 of hers, called the other doctors. They ended up getting her down to like 6 medicines instead of 27.
Yeah, and it's probably too because of all the side effects that she was having because of
Oh,
those interacting medications. And it's absolutely infuriating because this happens more than people realize. Because this is one of the things that really frustrates me, is our healthcare system is so fragmented. It's in what healthcare professionals call silos. Healthcare silos is a buzz term that you'll hear if you're in healthcare. But it's segmented out, and everybody is looking at one portion of the body instead of the individual as a whole. And it's really frustrating when you have a GP who is supposed to be looking at the whole perspective, because they don't get into the fine minutia. But I think sometimes they forget that they do still need to look at this whole picture together. And it doesn't mean it's almost like the GP hands their authority over to those consulting physicians, and then they don't feel that they have the knowledge or the ability to question what they're each doing. And when I worked in the hospital, I primarily dealt with heart failure. So when you have patients in especially advanced heart failure, which is the area that I worked, these patients have multiple issues. And what we would see time and time again, and the heart and the kidneys are very closely tied together. I mean,
absolutely.
you know that they kind of balance each other out and pick up where the other one's leaving off. And we would see the nephrologists or the kidney doctors and the cardiologists all the time, prescribing conflicting medications. And they're like, well, we need to protect the kidneys. No, we need to protect the heart. We need the kidneys to take on the extra work. Well, if we don't, back off and quit pressuring the kidneys so much, they're going to burn out, and we're going to have another failed organ system. And so it's so frustrating because I think ego gets in the way, and then the patient doesn't know and understand. And if we don't have nurses who are educated or primary care physicians who are educated, then there's so much room for error. And I think this happens every day, all the time.
I think it may be too just the sheer quantity of patients they each expect to have in their practice. They don't really take the time, most of them, to do that deep review or to look at, hey, by the way, what are the medications you're taking before I prescribe this one for you? Let's review that. I was very pleased recently with my osteopath that he actually, hey, and I said, well, I'm taking exactly one thing, man, for blood pressure. That's it. That's all. I said, yeah, that's it. So usually at your age, I said, well, maybe I hope to be the exception. That's all I take. And if I could get around it, I wouldn't take that. And he said, oh, good. So then he, looked at something else that might be useful. But he's very careful that way. And I have noticed they usually don't ask that question. Usually nobody says, by the way, what else are you taking before I write this for you? There
So
should be that, I always look at the GP as like a traffic manager and a coordinator of care, ideally.
some of that is taken care of in the computer system. If they're using computerized charting systems, which most of them are because that came through with Obamacare, but I think they rely on the fact that your medication list, usually a nurse will come in and ask, oh, what medications are you taking? And they will pull all of them together and have them there on your chart. And then the responsibility of the doctor would then be to go look at that before prescribing. But when you have all of these drugs in all of these different classes, knowing all of them, you would have to do a comprehensive review. And a lot of times they just rely on the computer to say, oh no, this might be contraindicated. And then hope that maybe the pharmacist would catch that. And one of the things that they really pushed us when I worked in the insurance company is to utilize one pharmacy. And, typically for the insurance company, a lot of that was for the cost savings because I recently learned that pretty much filling the retail pharmacies, these brick and mortar pharmacies that are on every corner, they're losing money. They're outsourcing the filling of prescriptions to a centralized location. So like I live in a pretty decent sized city, but they're outsourcing a lot of this to our state capital. And so they fill all the prescriptions, like the regular prescriptions there, and then they do just the one-offs in the store because they focus on other things like giving vaccines to increase their profit margin. And so it's absolutely insane. But the other logical reason, and this would be a good reason, if you go through one pharmacy, the likelihood of catching those errors, it's much greater because they see that whole list of medications. And pharmacists are wealths of knowledge. I have a lot of respect for them in the knowledge that they have and the ability they have to educate and support patients in understanding their medications, preventing errors, separating out. But it takes time, and patients don't want to do that. And that was one of the big things that I would spend doing when I worked for the insurance company, is going through and doing a comprehensive medication review and seeing how many of these medications are complementary, how many of them are antagonistic, and all the things. So it's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you were able to do that. Well, when we talk about all these issues that we have with the allopathic care system, which is certainly they're glaring and they're there. Ashley, from your perspective, having been in the system and beside it as someone in the insurance business who are, I guess you'd say, they're the buyers of the services of the system. Would that be a good way to put it?
It's very interesting that you bring this up because recently, I don't know if I've told you this. I have a podcast that I co-host on called Nurses Out Loud, and I get the pleasure of working with two other nurses, and one of them, his name is Dave. He does these fantastic deep dives, and we investigate medication fraud, like the scandals surrounding Vioxx, antidepressants. We
Yeah.
just did one on Zantac and all the issues with those medications. But I get so frustrated, and I asked kind of a similar question. If these medications are so detrimental, like Zantac is the one we were talking about when this came up, Zantac creates this known carcinogen, right? And they left it on the market. There's other drugs that are on the market. They knew about this prior to releasing it, and it was on the market for almost 40 years, and we were giving it to patients all the time, and they just kind of like went along with it. And there are scores of lawsuits now that you can go see. And there was, I can't remember how many $1 billion paid out to over 80,000 plaintiffs for Zantac. And that brought to mind the question, insurance companies have to pay insane amounts of money for all the damage that's being done by these drugs. Why are the insurance companies not standing up and fighting back? And what Dave kind of had said is, he goes, I've kind of resigned myself to know and understand that these drug manufacturers are owned by the same companies that own the insurance companies. And
Yes.
so it's all just a bunch of actuarials sitting in a room somewhere calculating the cost. And the cost of selling these, or the profit of selling these drugs, outweighs the cost lost for insurance companies, because they're also siphoning that money off of you. So you're paying for them to kill you, essentially. And so it's absolutely insane when you think about the level of corruption and the way that claims are denied and this, that, and the other. And it all goes back. And I do believe that good people work in these industries, right? It's the industry, not necessarily some of the people. Now, the people up at the higher levels, the people that know that the corruption is there, that know the harms and damages are being done, those are not good people. I'm not making excuses for them,
Sure.
right? But the average Joe working in a pharmacy or at an insurance company, I loved my patients. I loved working with them. And, when you work with them long term, you get to know them quite well, and they kind of become like family. And there are several that I still pray for. I've been gone for 6 years. I don't even know if they're still alive, because they were elderly when I was taking care of them, and quite sick. But I still think of them often and pray for them, because you just kind of grow that attachment. So good people work in these industries, but overall the system is so corrupt. And I think that the only way to fight back against that is to refuse to compromise on your morals, and for each of us to take our own accountability and power and push back however that looks. And it's going to look different for everybody.
Sure. That totally makes sense. Interesting that you mentioned about Zantac. Wasn't that a proton pump inhibitor? Is that correct, for stomach distress?
No, I think it's I can't remember what class it is. Um I don't think it's a proton pump inhibitor. I think it's been replaced by the proton pump inhibitors. I think that's
So
kind
it
of,
was before that. Okay.
yeah. I mean, it's still for heartburn. I would have to look it up and see the
Yeah.
class, but definitely not something I'm
Well,
prescribing. The crazy thing.
one of my more recent articles was about all of the different prescription drugs, which actually lead us straight away. It's known, it's published, to dementia, and yet they're still widely prescribed. It's absolutely stunning to me when I started digging into it. It's right up there on my blog at teutonichealing.com. When you click the blog button, it's I think a second, third, or fourth article that's up on the current page. Um, I was quite surprised. Like, if they know these things, and I can find it on an NCBI publication, then why are they still being prescribed?
Well, and see, that's the thing, is that's absolutely crazy. So, when Zantac is part of the same class of medications, and it is an H2 antagonist. So it's slightly different. It works with histamines, and
Right.
reducing histamines. And so it was actually Tagamet at the beginning, and there was a report put out called the Tanner Report. And I got to give credit to my co-host Dave, who did all this research. I'll have to send you the link for that podcast. I think we did a 3-part series on
Yeah,
Zantac.
I'd love to see it. Sure.
Yeah, so it was Tagamet initially, and Tagamet did this study, and this was before Zantac hit like the most prescribed medication. Okay, so this report called the Tanner Report is out there, and it's hidden behind not only a paywall, but Dave has access to these court dockets. You have to pay for the account, and then you have to pay per page of reports. He was able to go log in, and this is government website, right? He was able to go in, he was able to find the Tanner Report, digging through all these exhibits to this case, and he couldn't read the full report. And this is one thing that I harp on all the time when we get into these pharmaceutical scandals, is the fact that all of this information is hidden in litigation. So we have to sue and have all this discovery, but then they block it from public view and they put gag orders on the people with the condition that if you don't sign the gag order, you won't get your payout. So it's just so corrupt. So this Tanner report was known before Zantac flew to the top of the charts and was prescribed to legitimately like every cardiac patient ever. And normal people. I took it for allergic reactions. Um, and so this was there. And the people from Tagamet tried to warn Zantac, or the makers of Zantac, and they ignored it. And so they knew this whole time and they just keep it hush hush. And again, we go back to the actuarials that are sitting behind saying, well, we can make more in profit by selling this drug than we will lose in lawsuits afterwards. And it's absolutely mind-blowing that the FDA just lets them get away with it.
Well, when you look at the whole sweep of the allopathic care systems we have now, the pharmaceutical / medical device care system that we have now, if you were to picture in your mind's eye, actually, a benevolent, useful, effective system, what would it look like? How different would it be than what we have now?
I think it would be made up of, we'd have to undo a lot of what was done with Obamacare. And I think to create the perfect healthcare system in one's mind would be very difficult because as you make the changes, obviously issues are going to arise and pop up. We have people who travel more frequently. And so the interconnectedness of these systems is very beneficial for those people traveling, going to different hospitals, etc., to a certain extent, because there are still flaws with that. But I think we would have to go back to the old school way where your doctor actually knew you, where he wasn't confined by the insurance company to how much time he could spend with you. And reimbursement rates would probably be tied to, how well your patients recover and the minimum amount. I love the fact that we're starting to see private, fee for service or subscription model providers coming up now. You'll see them in different places where the doctor says, okay, you pay a fee of X amount of dollars and I will keep you well. And you can come in and see me as often as you'd like. We can do all the things. Everything is covered. And I think that that's great because that gives the doctors incentives to correct the underlying issues and to have that patient be well. I think the risk there is, non-compliant patients aren't going to want to see those doctors. They're just going to want to see those prescriptions be written and they're not going to be well. And those physicians aren't going to want to care for the non-compliant patients in regards to diet and lifestyle modification, people who are going to take their health seriously and put in the work that's needed to be done. You can't just sit on the couch and eat Cheetos and drink a soda. Like that's not a meal.
No, it's not. Well, and follow up with the Little Debbie part of the candy and cake food group, right? Remember when the FDA had these food groups? Absolutely ridiculous. So where do you see this? Should there be another person in this healthcare team who is like a diet and lifestyle advisor interfacing? Because I'm just assuming this primary care physician doesn't really have time to do too much of that unless it's just egregious, like somebody's fingers are stained with smoking and they stink like a ashtray when they walk in. Certainly he'd say something about that, but otherwise it's hard for him to get into the minutiae of that.
I think that's where we have to have the cultural change. Simultaneously, as we're fixing this healthcare system, we also need to fix the cultural ideologies that are breaking us, right? We have to educate on whole food diet, whether you're going to eat meat or you're not, how do you get the appropriate amount of nutrients that your body needs? And then it can really be narrowed down to say, okay, something is not working right for this person. But what I see in these practices, and you'll have nurse practitioners, so they're prescribers, they can write your prescriptions. order your labs and all that, but they will hire nurses like myself, especially, board certified in functional medicine. They'll hire these nurses and these nurses help the patient. So they build their own little team. And the focus is really on that whole, I hate to say whole person wellness because that phrase has been bastardized, but that's a conversation for another day. But they're really looking at the whole individual and saying, okay, we've got to beef up the nutrition here. Okay, it looks like your immune system is activated. What kind of environmental poisons are causing you to have these flares? And they can, with that collaborative team approach, they can really work and improve the individual's health. So there is definitely that interdisciplinary team in that aspect.
Well, that sounds promising. Now, I don't know how many people will have that available to them, but I like the idea of it, certainly.
One of the biggest struggles is the fact that this is all out of pocket. It's not covered by insurance. So
Right.
unless they're transitioning into like a Christian health share ministry or something like that, sometimes those will cover these alternative type services. But I think the problem we run into, and I think that this is true across the board, we've become so dependent on allopathic medicine. The research and the studies for the benefits of these medications are so just obscene and untrustworthy, but it's the only thing we have to go on. Physicians are in a position where they only want to stick with the desired treatment path or program because that's all they know. And the same goes for the patient. The only thing I know is to put my faith and trust in this physician. And at least that takes the burden of accountability off of me and it places it on another individual. I have that kind of plausible deniability to say, well, the doctor failed me and not take any ownership. And so I think that is a huge part of why people will remain in this allopathic system, because not only do they get to blame the doctor if things don't go
But
the
the
way.
willful passivity, I don't have to be responsible for anything. I can keep doing what I'm doing and you're going to fix me no matter my lifestyle choices. Yeah.
Yeah. And it doesn't really fix you. That's the problem, is it's just kind of like a Band-Aid that helps you gimp along until it finally just, the bottom falls out. And I would love to see long-term studies on people who transition from the allopathic and go into this more holistic, functional, natural, whatever you want to call it, theme of care, and see what the long-term outcomes are. Just like sometimes we see people that go into hospice, they improve because you take away some of their pharmaceuticals and they actually get healthier. Their body is kind of finding balance. And so it'd be really interesting to see what the long-term outcomes for those patients would be. But it's hard to leave, especially when we are doing all of these things to our bodies, including vaccinations that cause more disease, that cause, increasingly more complex symptoms or health concerns that could be deadly without utilizing the allopathic system.
I know a woman who had that experience. She had cancer. She was under age 40 at the time, I think, and she was in hospice, and she switched to a holistic doctor, and he said, well, here's your problem. And within a few months, she was out of hospice. And like I said, that had to have been at least 15 years ago, and she's still alive and well today, never went back to allopathic care. So how would you suggest that someone find a practitioner who looks at the whole person? I mean, I check my insurance list to see where to find a doctor, and it's like that there isn't anybody that's actually good and available.
I think that's the problem. I think that because we rely on insurance to drive down the costs, then we're stuck with the doctors that they choose. And there's a Dr. Porter, Dr. Elizabeth Porter. She is a plastic surgeon. She's, kind of come across on social media because she's made a huge stink about insurance companies refusing to cover certain types of surgeries. And she's a plastic surgeon, but she does breast reconstruction and like the removal of lymph nodes and things like that for cancer patients. And she has really fought back. She actually recorded a peer-to-peer conversation. So she's trying to get authorization to do a procedure for her patient that's going to decrease her chance of long-term complications by 30%. Okay, so pretty significant there. But the insurance company got mad and removed her from their in-network provider list. So now she can't get reimbursed. That's how she has built her practice around this insurance paradigm. And so for me, when I think about this, and you've heard me talk at the state level, when we accept federal funding, then we have to follow federal rules. Well, when you accept insurance funding, you have to follow insurance rules. And this is the way that care is dictated and kind of, misconstrued. And there are some ways that a lot of money and time is wasted because you've got to jump through hoops before the doctor knows that you need a certain treatment. But the insurance company says, well, you haven't tried these lower cost alternatives first. And so they make
they actually end up paying more because they do the CAT scan and the ultrasound, which weren't needed in the first place, before finally approving the MRI, which the doctor knew right off was the only way you were going to pick up this soft tissue aberration. And so you're paying for 3 procedures instead of 1. So it's not even cost effective to do that in many cases, is it?
Yeah, and my guess is the way that the actuarials have it figured out, that even if they do, 10 or 100 patients with just stopping at the ultrasound, they can save more money than if they were just to jump right to the MRI for everybody. So once again, it comes down to that. How did they figure this out, and how are they crunching the numbers to minimize this? And the problem really becomes when the issue is one that progresses and becomes a greater detriment to the patient, because the insurance doesn't care about that. If you're dead, you're not paying in premiums, but you're not sucking the money out of the system either. And so there's that. But I think
I don't think insurance companies care about, I don't think they care if they're paying too much for services. They want to keep you coming in as a customer. So the more procedures they can get you signed up for, the more insurance you're going to keep buying to cover the procedures. So I think it helps them to keep their customers coming back.
I don't know about that. I would be tempted to really disagree on that, because the fact that we're seeing right now insurance premiums go up so much, and it's because the increased cost of care. And you look at what's happening, and even if you look at these things like Christian Health Share Ministry, and where you pay into a pot and your health care is covered because you're sharing the cost of each other's medical expenses, right? These companies are facing issues, and we're going to end up to the point where they're not going to be able to offer services either, because the population is getting so sick, medical care costs are so high, and there's this, quote, greater need that, like, you look at all the vaccine injured, their care requirements are astronomical. They don't want them to live. And that's exactly why in Canada, we have MAID services, medical aid in dying. They're offering this to children. It's cheaper for them to offer you euthanasia rather than keeping you on. And so this is a huge issue. I mean, insurance companies, and we're going to continue to see massive increases in our insurance premiums because of all the damage that these COVID jabs did, because it wrecked people. And we've seen significant payouts and increases in the number of people. It's crazy, because like life insurance, for example, they have had increased numbers of payouts for people between the ages of 18 and 65. This is your working class, the people who got these COVID vaccines. These people are dying out. They're having to pay these policies. So the benefits they're having to pay to the families. And guess what? The number of people paying into the company is dropping because they're dying. So you don't have to pay premiums anymore. This is a
Wow.
problem.
Yeah, big problem. And of course, most of your insurance companies, the biggest thing they invest in is commercial real estate. And so as the economy kind of tanks due to speculation and the control of the entire economy by very few at the top, the cryptocracy, the plutocracy, whatever you want to call them, that has gone way, way down. There's a very low occupancy in most urban centers. So that's going to be interesting to see where that goes. I wonder how these insurance companies are going to stay afloat with their main moneymaker there tanking and a large
And
number of their people dying out that are sprouting all these new symptoms.
yeah, and it's wild because like we pay quite a bit every 2 weeks. I think it's getting close to $300 every 2 weeks for corporate insurance, and it sucks. We are paying so much money, and we don't even like, I don't see a regular dentist that's in network because I'm not going to use fluoride and I don't want amalgam fillings. And my dentist told me I was nuts for wanting my amalgams out. And so I was like, well, it's time for us to find a new dentist. I'll see you later, buddy.
Yep. Yeah.
So you know, it really stinks because I'm sitting here going, can we switch to something like how can we do this? Because we don't really use allopathic care. It would just be for catastrophic injury. I can get labs as a functional medicine practitioner for cost. So I can do a full functional panel for under $200. You know, I pass that savings on to my clients because I think that it should be affordable. It's absolutely wild. And that's part of my service fee is I just say, okay, we're going to do a basic lab panel and it's going to be paid for. And you just need to go get the blood drawn. You don't need to do anything else. You pay for my services, you get that covered. And so, you know, what do we really need? We don't take any medications, all of this stuff, but yet we're paying $500, $600 a month into this insurance scheme with essentially no benefit.
Yeah. And just so you can hold on to what little bit of that does cover catastrophic, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think the other thing is too, your insurers are not going to want to, I mean, it took them a long time to even approve chiropractic as part of the package. They didn't cover that for a long time. Now they do. They see it's very cost effective. And now some of them even cover Reiki. But again, this is a very recent admission. And I can see the point at which, even if I'm an insurer, if you've got an herbal practitioner or a naturopathic practitioner, which we're very much in that category, and you say, okay, this person's got a problem with the kidneys, let's reinforce the kidneys by using a copious amount of barley water to rebuild the kidneys, the specific proteins that actually help to restore the kidneys, as opposed to a medication. Now, barley's a hell of a lot cheaper than a medication. So if you're the insurer, that bill for that pound of barley is going to be a significant saving over paying for that script.
But if your insurance companies are the same ones shilling out
selling the
pharmaceutical
prescription.
drugs.
Yeah. Right.
Oh, it's so
Yes,
frustrating.
It's
And
huge conflict of interests. Yeah.
I think the only reason that in some cases Reiki and of course chiropractic came through is because of the VA, strikingly. I think that they saw, correct me if I'm wrong, I think they saw in those
Oh, you're right. They saw it was a
populations.
benefit to do that, just like allowing, and the VA is looking for blanket solutions for blanket problems without having ever to admit the source of the problems. It took them forever to admit that PTSD was a real thing that applied to a lot of people, or Gulf War syndrome. You just go through the list. There's a whole bunch of things that they are the ultimate deniers. We won't deny a coverage. We'll just deny that the problem exists. There you go. So at a fundamental level, we then don't have
Napalm.
to deal with it. And then eventually they come up with pseudo solutions like, instead of PTSD, really digging into what's going on. No, we'll just teach you to do eye shifting and finger tapping and call it EFT treatment and say that's reducing your symptoms. Of course, the guy goes home and commits suicide 2 weeks later. They don't count that. They just say, well, his last report, his symptoms were improved. So
Yeah.
it's how you keep these phony statistics too. As part of the medical scam. Lots of phony statistics.
It's what I call magic math.
It's what you choose to measure, very subjectively determined.
And that's what we see time and time again in these studies for these medications is just this magic math, or we recently did a podcast on gender affirming care, and it's kind of the same thing. The leaders in these industries, and I say industries for a reason, they cherry pick their evidence. They cherry pick their study participants. They don't bother to follow up. And then it's marketing, because then they can take, and even if the results come back bad, they can use statistics and the way that they report numbers to make this look like a miracle. And it's just really great marketing, but really bad science.
Yeah. Well, what's the old saying? Numbers don't lie, but liars sure as hell use numbers.
That's the truth. Absolutely amazing. So what would you do? You asked me what would be my perfect idea. What would you do to fix healthcare?
The free market.
Yeah.
Meaning that whatever modality you choose as a healthcare consumer, you get to do that freely, and it's freely available. And you don't have an allopathic oligopoly, which can have somebody else arrested or charged, or a court injunction not to do what they're doing. Whereas if you decide to go with Harry Hoxley back when he was in business, and he's a naturopath in Texas, and he's curing cancer, which they really pisses them off if you cure cancer,
Yeah, that's a surefire way to accidentally hang yourself.
Oh yeah, well he actually won. He's the only guy in history that I think of who actually won a suit against the AMA. But the judge was so corrupt, he gave Harry a $2 award in a Texas federal court, suing the AMA, countersuing the AMA. But I would just say freedom of choice. And I think that's what they're really afraid of. If whatever works, consumer beware, consumer buy, and compare what it does for you. And if it doesn't work, you do something else. It may sound really simplistic, but I think there's a lot of value in that.
I think where they can dispel, because this is something, that for at least the past 5 years, I've been involved with conversations about just this, and where the industry, whether that be pharma, hospital, insurance, etc., really wins is by saying, well, there are swindlers and crooks, and we're accredited, and we're safe, and we're government backed. So they use these it's almost a logical fallacy. It's almost a false sense of superiority. And it's crazy because, I talk about board certification in functional medicine, and all that is, it's a piece of paper, right? And almost anybody can go out and do these different things. Like, you become a doctor by being able to memorize. You become a lawyer by being able to memorize. And it's just mind-blowing. Like, that there are people out there that are crooks and swindlers, and we see it all the time, that have these notes of accreditation or affirmation. And so I think that that's where people really need to check in with themselves and say, okay, am I avoiding this care modality because I'm afraid of a swindler? What are the risks? And everything we do, when you buy a car, you take a huge risk, especially a used car, but even brand new cars, they come with risks that they're not going to work. They're going to break down. They're going to have recalls. How many cars have recalls now? It's absolutely insane.
Well, I think that the line that is offered to the public to sell the idea of restriction of market choices is always, we're going to protect you from the bad guys. We're going to protect you from the quacks. We're going to protect you from swindlers. I'm going, well, you didn't protect us from the COVID shots that don't work and don't even stop the disease they were named for stopping. So who else are you going to protect us? You didn't protect us from oxycodone, OxyContin, Vioxx, thalidomide. I mean, you name it. The number of failures of the FDA is just legion. You just bowed to wherever the money was. And I mean, after all, what is it? 75% of the FDA's operating funds come from big pharma, do they not? From the very industries they're supposed to be regulating. So who's regulating whom here?
Yeah, the fox guarding the hen house for sure. I'm not sure on those exact figures, but I would not be surprised in the least if it was even more than that. But I think we talked about this a little bit last time, and if we did, we can shift gears. But safe haven laws or safe harbor laws, have you heard of those where
No, I have not.
so National Health Freedom Action is an organization, I'm pretty sure we talked about them last time. They're a great group of individuals. They've been in this fight for health freedom and medical liberty, whatever you want to call it, for decades. And what they really strive to do, or one of their big projects, is these safe harbor laws where people work together to pass a law at the state level so that way people who are practicing in good faith cannot be charged for practicing medicine without a license. So these would be your naturopaths, your homeopaths, and all of those things, because that's what happens. That's how they chase these people out, and they prevent them is by, oh, well, you don't have our license. You're not part of our cool kids club. Well, I don't practice the same way you do. So those safe harbor laws, if you're interested, if you have a group that works at state legislative level, or that's something you might be interested in doing, definitely check out National Health Freedom Action and their safe harbor laws, because I think that that would be a big way to help increase this idea of free market. But again, I think it goes back to the idea that we have to break ourselves of the idea that insurance needs to cover my care, because if you accept insurance money, you have to follow insurance rules. And the best practitioners are done playing. Like our dentist, they won't even take, one of the dentists in the office won't even take insurance.
Yeah. Yeah, understood. Could you forward us how to contact those people, the full name and all that? And Laurie, is it possible to put that up in our show notes?
Will do my best.
All right, that would be great. I'd like for people to be able to contact that resource. But I think this is something that's generally done when you want to limit the number of suppliers. You create a licensing agency or a licensing board or whatever. Classic example would be banks. Used to be people could pretty much set up their own bank with a limited amount of money. So you could actually practice rational lending rather than fictional, fractional, I call it fictional lending, where you have $1,000 in the bank, but you can loan out $20,000 as if it were actually sitting in your vaults and get back all this money plus interest from that. So it's quite a Ponzi scheme that they have going. And now it's very hard for any independent group looking to compete against established banks to do so. It's really set up not to protect the consumer. It is set up to protect the current suppliers from competition. And that's the way these things are always set up. It's government at service of industries. Government not at service to the citizens or the taxpayers or the voters, but strictly at service to the oligopoly.
When you take a step back, you'll start to see, when you look at this pattern and this theme, and I think it's important to point out these different themes across all of these different industries, because it is everywhere, right? And once you start to note that by the government having, or the powers that be, whether it's the state, federal, local, global, quote, government, the World Economic Forum, when they have the power to control these things, they will rule the roost, and they will decide who is essential and who is not. And we've seen, back to that safe harbor law and the need for a license, we've seen this within doulas. Doulas are kind of that extra advocate that can go into the hospitals with you, or maybe they work with you for your home birth, but aren't quite the midwife. Their sole focus is helping support you and your body through the different phases of labor, which are quite intense. But they are forcing them to be licensed, and they're using this fear tactic. We've watched this with midwives. You have to have a certain level of education to be a midwife now. It didn't used to be that way. And it's a means of controlling birth. Well, if we get you hooked into the system right at the start of your life, we're going to have control and be able to breed that fear and keep you following our rules instead of, nature.
Well, another group that was affected by that was you used to have pastoral counselors in all states, and now in most states, to be a licensed pastoral counselor. I used to have a license like that, actually, let it lapse, so I shouldn't have. You have to actually jump through these hoops and basically get APA certification to do the same ridiculous psychotherapy that doesn't work presently. That has to be what you present, like that's going to be your main approach.
Yeah, it's so wild how they do that, and you are indoctrinated. And this is one of the things too, is, how do we continue to raise up nurses who critically think, who are able to push back and really strongly advocate for their patients when they're not taught you have to follow, and to get your license, you have to follow their set of rules and do things the way that they say is right, even though hey, if we would support your body with some magnesium or, as you said, some barley, we could really see changes in the function of your kidneys. We could see changes in your blood pressure. We could see changes in the amount of stress that you have, weight issues, thyroid, it's absolutely insane. But when you're in the system, oh, nope, we prescribe this medication for that.
Yeah, rather than your sleeping pills, how about some magnesium glycinate to help you go to sleep?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's
Instead
right.
of your
Good for-
Zantac, some betadine.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of different things we could do as alternatives. But I think the more we open up alternative care, I think the more cost effective it is, for one thing, for the public in general. So they get to choose what they're going to do. They could choose the direction we're going with it.
Well, and on top of that, you're not forced to do something that you don't want to do. Or when a
Right.
therapy fails, you aren't forced to continue utilizing that therapy because it's the protocol, because otherwise my doctor is going to get dinged. Or worse, maybe the therapy works on paper, but you feel absolutely horrible. And so you have additional symptoms. And when is that? When does the risk outweigh the benefit? When do the side effects overcome and obliterate any benefit that you're having? And that's terrifying.
Well, they're protecting this pocket of money by trying to force you to not have any alternatives to it. One example would be a scoliosis. I think of a 38-year-old gentleman with scoliosis, pretty significant, not maybe 5 degrees, double loop scoliosis. And he had gone and seen about it. The Marine Corps had said, well, we don't have to operate on that. That's below the threshold at which we would consider an operation. VA wouldn't do it. And so he was looking at what would it be through his private insurance. Now that he's working in the corporate world, it was going to be a ridiculous amount and the surgery itself, getting into the back and doing that would have been very debilitating. Out of work for months, all of that stuff, wearing braces, et cetera. And I said, dude, we'll use psychic surgery. We'll liquefy the tissue, we'll move things over, we'll lengthen these ligaments, shorten these ligaments, we'll make everything line up and do it. And well, we did it. It took 3 sessions, cost him about $270 and done. No side effects. Versus theirs, which would have taken several $1,000s and taken months. So I think this is the problem, that we run into. They're very much afraid of the less expensive and less complicated way of doing things.
Well, this is a whole nother conversation I'm about to open up. When you it's not just the loss of the money, but when you open people's minds to the power of the spirit, the power of, the mind, I do believe, we have different backgrounds in God or gods, whatever. But I do believe that God has gifted us with these abilities. And whether it's from your perspective or my perspective, they line up quite closely. with the ability to heal through the power of God. And if you tell people that, if you allow them to know and understand that that gift is available to them, then the whole system crumbles.
And that sounds like a great discussion for part 3.
Well, the funny thing is that, when you look at the allopathic follow-up, when somebody's been in our care, and Laurie, I think you had knowledge of a situation like this where a shoulder was severely broken, and you might recall that I had to stitch it up, and then the patient went to a regular allopathic review later. For what reason, I wasn't sure, but just to see if there was anything else they could do or anything that was needed. And they could actually see the stitches, and the allopath got quite angry and said, "Why are you showing me? It's clear this is an old surgery. It's been healed for years. Get out of my office. You must be some sort of psycho," basically.
Yep, that was my left shoulder. I still have full functionality of my whole left arm after a severe break, and you corrected the broken bone over a Zoom call in about 5 minutes.
But even the interesting thing was the physician you could actually see on the X-ray the marks where the bone had been stitched back together.
Yep, you could see the stitch marks in the bone on the X-ray, and the doctor just wouldn't even look. And that was 2 weeks before you were here locally. I invited him to come to my house and meet you, and he didn't show up.
Well, yeah, that protecting that privileged status. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be done with that, and even looking at psychosomatic medicine from the perspective of, I don't care what somebody's background is, just teaching them to visualize a better outcome, to be optimistic, to see the tissue moving in this direction instead of that direction. So that's the reason we go through a lot of the physiological and anatomical training, is to learn the direction in which we need to intend things to go, so we put our weight in the right direction to help the process of healing. But I think even when you can incorporate the patient's will and purpose into being aligned with our will and purpose for seeing this get better, where they want to take an active role, that is so powerful. It is so effective. Like I say, regardless of their background, just to get them to look at it and visualize it's moving in a particular direction makes a big difference in how the body then responds.
I couldn't agree more. Even if the allopathic world would say that it's placebo effect, it's still 30% effective.
I think they just layer the word placebo over anything they can't explain, rather than admitting that all these other levels exist. Well, this is where I think the work of people like Joe Dispenza is so very helpful in kind of bridging the gap between where they're at, the allopathic establishment, and where we're at, kind of our fringe medicine, so to speak, our very old form of medical practice.
Well, I feel like what doctors do is they have like a list of if this, then that. If this is the symptom, then you prescribe this drug. And they don't think beyond that to say, well, is there some context to this? Because that's not where the money is. It's all like, which buttons do I push to get paid? I can take this path or that path. And the rest of it just doesn't matter. So they have to shut down the context so they can get back into the path that makes money.
Some of our old good doctors do look outside those paradigms. They really do a good job of critical thinking. And unfortunately, I remember in nursing school, pathophysiology and pharmacology, those were the two main staples. That's what they teach. And so I do think that there is hope for some of these new doctors coming out of these schools, because as you're exposed to the different healing modalities, as you're exposed to critical thinking, as you see patterns happening with your patients, if you are not too proud, if your ego has not completely taken over, you can see that. And sometimes it just takes the right experience to lead you down that path. And so I think that that's the hope that I would give your listeners, is that we have these people out there. There is this shift in the paradigm. And just like, you were talking about, imagine, visualize, send that energy for healing, not only to an individual, but to humanity and to these systems that we want to see corrected, because where we put that energy and that will, that spirit tends to follow.
I quite agree. Well, Ashley, it's been a pleasure having you on, and appreciate your illuminating all these dark corners of the medical world for us, those of us who aren't part of it. This has been very, very useful. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, whether this is your first time on our podcast or you're a repeat listener. We'll explore many other interesting topics and the odd sides of things in coming episodes. And I thank Laurie as our producer and research person and web person who makes all of this possible. And thank you, Ashley, for showing up and helping us understand this topic better. And until next time, this is Georg signing out for Shamanic Voices. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Shamanic Voices. Please like and subscribe so that you won't miss our coming episode, where we always try to have engaging and interesting topics and or guests. Thank you, and go with the gods.